It is August 26th, 1981. The location is the demilitarized zone, the scarred strip of land separating North and South Korea. A North Korean general leans over the radar scope. His eyes are locked on a ghost. For months, he has watched this specific ghost haunt his airspace. It appears on the scan, streaks across the sky faster than any MiG-21 aircraft can scramble, and vanishes before his artillery can calculate a firing solution. But today is different. Today they are not reacting. Today they are waiting. They know the route, they know the timing, and most importantly, they have moved their deadliest asset into a secret position right beneath the flight path. On the radar screen, the blip accelerates. It is moving at speeds that defy the laws of conventional aerodynamics. The general nods to the battery commander. The order is given, 300 miles per hour. That is the speed of the trap snapping shut. High above the clouds, on the edge of space, Major Maury Rosenberg looks at his instrument panel. He is strapped into the cockpit of the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft ever built. He is flying at 80,000 feet. The sky above him is not blue. It is a deep, bruised black. The curve of the earth is visible through the quartz glass of his windshield. Suddenly, the silence of the stratosphere is shattered by a violently red warning light on his dashboard. The digital automatic flight control system screams a warning. Detailed analysis confirms the worst-case scenario. A radar lock. Not a search radar, but a tracking radar. A fan-song radar guidance system has latched onto his metal skin. Down in the mud of the peninsula, a massive cloud of dust kicks up. An SA-2 guideline missile roars out of its canister. It rides a column of fire, accelerating to Mach 3.5 in seconds. It is a telephone pole packed with high explosives, designed specifically to kill American spy planes. The North Korean general watches the two blips on his screen merge. The missile and the plane are on a collision course. He smiles. He believes he is about to become the man who brought down the Blackbird, but he does not understand what is happening inside that cockpit. He does not understand that Maury Rosenberg is not just a pilot. He is a master of energy management. And he does not understand that the plane he is shooting at is not just a machine. It is a monster that feeds on speed. Before we see who wins this race between a missile and the fastest plane alive, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We decode the classified history you were never taught before. Click the button now. Let's get back to the cockpit. To understand why this moment is so confusing for the North Korean command, we have to look at the board. We have to understand the arrogance of the trap. It is 1981. The Cold War has entered a dangerous new freeze. Ronald Reagan is in the White House, and the rhetoric between East and West is sharpening. In the Korean Peninsula, the tension is a physical weight. The North acts as a proxy for Soviet aggression, testing the boundaries of American resolve. For the North Korean military leadership, the SR-71 is not just an aircraft, it is an insult. It flies over their territory with impunity. It photographs their troop movements, their nuclear facilities, their breakfast tables, and it does so without weapons. It doesn't need guns. Its weapon is invulnerability. The North Korean generals have studied the patterns. They know the Americans fly a specific route known as the Jerome track. It is a predictable flight path that skirts the edge of international waters, peering deep into the north. They have done the math. They possess the SA-2 missile system. This is Soviet technology. It is the same system that shot down Francis Gary Powers in his U-2 spy plane over Russia in 1960. It is a proven killer. The generals believe the math is simple. The SA-2 flies at Mach 3.5. The American plane flies at Mach 3. Therefore, the missile is faster. If they fire from a head-on angle, the closure rate will be nearly Mach 7. No pilot can react to that. They move a mobile missile battery into the Kaesong Heights. They camouflage it. They wait for weeks. They maintain absolute radio silence. They are hunting a tiger, but they are making a critical error in their calculation. They are assuming the SR-71 behaves like a normal aircraft. They assume that to evade, a pilot must turn. In aerial combat, turning bleeds energy. Turning slows you down. If Maury Rosenberg turns, the missile will cut the corner and destroy him. But the SR-71 was designed by Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works division to break the rules of physics. In the cockpit, Maury Rosenberg and his reconnaissance systems officer Ed McKim are not panicked. They are focused. They are wearing full pressure suits, looking like astronauts, because if the cabin pressure fails at this altitude, their blood will boil instantly. The heat on the outside of the windshield is over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction of the air is literally cooking the airframe. The plane is expanding, stretching several inches in length as the titanium heats up. Maury checks his fuel flow. He is burning through thousands of pounds of JP7 fuel every minute. The engines, massive J58 turbo ramjets, are in their element. Then, the tone in his headset changes. It is the tone of imminent death. The North Korean radar operator has waited for the perfect moment. The aircraft is turning slightly to align with the DMZ. Its profile is exposed. The launch indicator illuminates in the bunker. The general watches the telemetry. The missile is tracking perfectly. It is climbing through 40,000 feet, 50,000 feet. It is hungry. Let's freeze the frame for a second. We need to talk about what Mach 3 really means. At Mach 3, you are traveling at roughly 2,300 miles per hour. That is faster than a rifle bullet. You are covering 33 miles every single minute. The North Korean missile, the SA-2, uses a blast fragmentation warhead. It does not need to hit the plane directly. It only needs to get close within a few hundred feet and detonate. The cloud of shrapnel will shred the delicate engines of the Blackbird, and at that speed, any structural damage causes the plane to disintegrate instantly. The North Korean general knows this. He expects the missile to explode in front of the plane, creating a wall of steel that the SR-71 will fly into. Back in the cockpit, Ed McKim, the RSO in the back seat, calls out the threat. Missile launch, 6 o'clock, or perhaps 12 o'clock. The reports vary on the exact angle, but the threat is singular. Maury Rosenberg does not bank the plane. He does not dive. He does exactly what the North Koreans think is impossible. He pushes the throttle forward. The throttle of the SR-71 has a final detent. It is the maximum afterburner setting. When you push past the standard limits, you are asking the engines to consume fuel at a rate that drains the tanks in minutes. You are asking the inlet spike's massive cones at the front of the engines to retract and manage a shockwave that could tear the engine apart if it unstarts. Maury creates a unstart risk to save his life. He demands more. The sensors on the SA-2 missile are confused. The missile's guidance computer predicts where the plane will be in 5 seconds based on its current speed, but the plane is not maintaining speed. It is accelerating. Mach 3.1, Mach 3.2. The airframe groans. The temperature on the nose cone spikes to nearly 1,000 degrees. The North Korean radar operator sees the data. The target is pulling away. But how? The physics say the missile is faster, but the missile is climbing against gravity. It is fighting thick air to get to thin air. Its rocket motor burns for only a limited time. Once the fuel is gone, the missile becomes a coasting bullet. It starts to lose speed. The SR-71, however, gets more efficient the faster it goes. The ramjet effect kicks in. The faster air is forced into the engine, the more thrust it generates. It is a runaway feedback loop of power. Rosenberg is surfing a shockwave. Mach 3.3. The distance between the hunter and the prey begins to stabilize. The missile is straining. Its guidance fins are flapping wildly in the thin air, trying to adjust to the new intercept point. The North Korean general leans closer to the screen. The two blips are merging. This is it. The SA-2 reaches its terminal phase. Its proximity fuse detects the massive metal return of the SR-71. It detonates. A massive sphere of high explosive energy erupts in the stratosphere. Shrapnel traveling at supersonic speeds fans out in a deadly cone. In the cockpit, Rosenberg and McKim feel a thump. It is a vibration that travels through the titanium spine of the aircraft. It is the shockwave of the explosion catching up to them. But here is the twist. The missile detonated where the computer thought the plane would be, but Rosenberg had pushed the Blackbird to a speed that the Soviet engineers who designed the missile had never accounted for. The plane is not there. The SR-71 is a mile down the road. The shrapnel flies harmlessly into empty space. The shockwave ripples through the contrail of the Blackbird, but the aircraft itself is racing away, untouched. On the ground, the radar screen blooms with the static of the explosion. The North Korean command room erupts in cheers. They see the bloom. They assume the target is destroyed. The general claps his hands. They have done it. They have blinded the Americans. They wait for the debris. They wait for the slow, tumbling return of falling wreckage on the radar. But the screen clears. The static fades. And there, emerging from the chaos, is the blip. It is still there. It is still moving. And it is moving faster than before. The cheer dies in the general's throat. The silence in the bunker is heavier than the concrete walls. They watch in absolute disbelief as the target climbs higher, turns casually to the south, and exits their airspace. It is a ghost. It is invincible. The general looks at his technicians. He demands an explanation. Did the fuse fail? Did we miss? The technicians are baffled. The math said they should have hit. The guidance was perfect. The radar lock was solid. The missile performed exactly as designed. They cannot accept the reality. The American machine simply outran the explosion. Maury Rosenberg and Ed McKim land back at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. As they taxi into the hangar, the heat radiating from the aircraft is so intense that the ground crew cannot touch it for an hour. The ticking sound of cooling titanium fills the hangar. They climb out, their flight suits soaked in sweat. They have just survived the impossible. But the story doesn't end there. This is where the Cold War gets truly cold. The United States government does not hold a press conference. They do not brag about the invasion. They do not release the footage. Why? Because mystery is a weapon. By staying silent, they force the North Koreans to question their own technology. The North Korean generals are left wondering if the Americans have a secret jamming device, or a laser system, or a force field. They do not realize it was simply raw speed and the nerves of a pilot named Maury. This uncertainty paralyzes the enemy. If your best missile can't catch the target, what can? The North Koreans spent millions upgrading their radar networks after 1981. They chased ghosts for decades. They fired explosions into the empty sky, hoping to catch the Blackbird. They never did. Over 4,000 missiles were fired at the SR-71 program over its lifetime. Not a single one ever brought a Blackbird down. Maury Rosenberg's flight on that August day remains one of the closest calls in the history of the program, October 1988. The muddy plains of the Magdeburg training area, German Democratic Republic, a biting wind whipped across the vast, churned-up landscape, carrying the metallic scent of diesel exhaust and damp earth. Inside the cramped, dimly lit commander's cupola of a T-80U, Major Dmitry Volkov felt the familiar, bone-jarring lurch as his driver navigated a trench. The powerful 1,250 horsepower gas turbine engine, the pride of Soviet engineering, whined with a high-pitched fury that vibrated through the steel hull and into his bones. Below him, his crew moved with the practiced, economical motions of men who had spent more time inside this 46-ton beast than in their own homes. For Dmitry, this was home. It was the heart of the Third Shock Army, the iron fist of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, poised to punch through the Fulda Gap and be on the banks of the Rhine in 72 hours. Today was about rehearsing that punch. Target identified. His gunner, Sergeant Borin, announced, his voice a calm, metallic rasp over the intercom. Stationary armor. 2 to 1,000 meters. Through his panoramic sight, Dmitry saw it the stark green silhouette of a mocked-up NATO tank, a Chieftain perhaps, or an M60. Obsolete coffins. He watched as Borin's hands flew across the fire control panel, the autoloader ramming a 125mm armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot round a tungsten dart known as a Zveroboy, the beast slayer, into the breach with a hydraulic clang. The sound was the percussion of inevitable victory. "Fire!" Dmitry ordered, his voice flat. The world outside his vision block dissolved in a flash of orange and a cloud of cordite. The T-80 rocked back on its suspension, a violent, satisfying recoil. A second later, the intercom crackled. Direct hit. Target neutralized. A smirk touched Dmitry's lips. It was too easy. They had been practicing this for years, honing the edge of the Red Army's spear until it was sharper than any in the world. They were the heirs to the heroes of Kursk, masters of the tank, and their machines were the finest expression of that mastery. Later that evening, in a damp, smoky briefing tent, Dmitry and his fellow officers reviewed intelligence reports. They were shown grainy photographs of the Americans' newest tank, the M1 Abrams, A ripple of quiet laughter went through the room. The thing was a monster high profile, heavy, and they were told powered by a ridiculously thirsty helicopter engine. 100 liters per hour, at idle, one captain scoffed, shaking his head. They will run out of fuel before they reach the first river. They saw it as a perfect reflection of American culture, bloated, overly complex, and built for comfort, not for the brutal, high-speed reality of a European war. Dmitri had seen the schematics leaked by their GRU spies. He knew its armor was some new composite, but he had absolute faith in the kinetic energy of their tungsten penetrators. Soviet science had solved the problem of armor decades ago. There was no material on Earth that could withstand a hypervelocity dart traveling at over 1,700 meters per second, striking a single point. It was a matter of physics. He and his men looked at the pictures of the clumsy-looking Abrams and felt not fear, but a surge of confidence. They couldn't wait to meet these land yachts on the battlefield. They were sure they knew exactly what would happen. This supreme arrogance, born from decades of doctrine and a profound misunderstanding of their enemy, was about to be shattered against an enemy they couldn't possibly comprehend. To see more stories of how technology, ideology, and reality collided during the Cold War, make sure you subscribe to Cold War Impact. To understand the Soviet laughter, one must first understand the Soviet soul of warfare. For the Red Army, the tank was not merely a weapon. It was an article of faith, the physical manifestation of their entire military doctrine, deep battle. Conceived in the 1,930 seconds and perfected through the brutal, continent-spanning slaughter of the Second World War, deep battle was a philosophy of overwhelming mass, speed, and shock. The plan for World War III was not a cautious, defensive engagement, but a terrifying, non-stop offensive. Waves of tanks, organized into operational maneuver groups, would pour through NATO lines, bypassing strongpoints, severing lines of communication, and relentlessly driving deep into the enemy's rear. The goal was to cause a complete strategic collapse, to have T-72 seconds and T-80 seconds on the streets of Brussels and Paris before the West could even consider a nuclear response. It was a war to be won in a single, lightning-fast campaign. The tanks themselves were designed as perfect instruments for this philosophy. The T-64, T-72, and T-80 were a family of machines built on a shared set of principles that were utterly alien to the West. They were small, with low silhouettes that made them difficult to hit. They were lightweight, allowing them to traverse the bridges and soft ground of Europe at high speed. And, most importantly, they were mass-producible. The Soviet Union could churn them out from colossal factories like Uralvagonzavod at a rate the West could only dream of. The secret to their design was the autoloader. By replacing the human loader with a mechanical carousel that sat at the crew's feet, they reduced the crew to 3 and were able to shrink the entire vehicle. This created a virtuous cycle. A smaller tank needed a smaller engine, less armor, and was ultimately cheaper and faster to build. Soviet designers accepted a trade-off that was unthinkable to their American counterparts. Crew survivability was a secondary concern. The ammunition was stored in the open inside the crew compartment. If the armor was breached, the resulting explosion would be catastrophic, instantly vaporizing the crew and blowing the turret clean off the hull in a phenomenon grimly known as a jack-in-the-box. But this was a calculated risk. In Soviet military calculus, the individual tank and its crew were expendable assets. What mattered was the unstoppable momentum of the armored horde. Losses were expected, planned for, and would simply be replaced by the next wave. The gun was paramount. The 125mm 2A46 smoothbore cannon was a fearsome weapon, more powerful than the 105mm rifled gun that equipped the vast majority of NATO tanks for decades. Firing hypervelocity, saboted rounds, Soviet tankers were confident they could kill any tank the West could field, from any angle. Intelligence from their spies in the West only reinforced this confidence. They saw the Abrams as a deeply flawed machine. Its AGT-1500 gas turbine engine was a logistical nightmare, a delicate, complex piece of machinery that consumed fuel at an astronomical rate and required massive amounts of clean air, a liability on a dusty or debris-strewn battlefield. Its sheer size and weight, nearly 60 tons, would confine it to major roads and sturdy bridges, limiting its tactical flexibility. They believed its advanced electronics would be prone to failure in the chaos of combat. To the Soviet mind, the M1 Abrams was a technological folly, a product of a society that had lost touch with the grim realities of industrial-scale warfare. They had built a scalpel for a war that would be fought with sledgehammers. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the American approach to tank design was born from a place of deep anxiety and a shocking wake-up call. That call came on October 6, 1973, during the Yom Kippur War. In the deserts of the Sinai, Israeli armored brigades, supremely confident after their stunning victory in 1967, were suddenly decimated. Egyptian infantry, armed with Soviet-made Saga anti-tank guided missiles and RPG-7 seconds, stood their ground and slaughtered the attacking Israeli M48 and M60 Patton tanks. It was a horrifying revelation for Western military observers. The era of the tank's battlefield dominance was potentially over. A single soldier with a relatively cheap, man-portable weapon could now destroy a multi-million-dollar main battle tank. The age-old balance between armor and anti-armor had been violently upended. For the US Army, still reeling from the trauma of Vietnam and tasked with holding the line in Europe against a numerically superior Warsaw Pact, this was an existential crisis. They knew they could never match the Soviets tank for tank. Their only hope was to create a tank that could qualitatively overwhelm the enemy, a tank that could survive the new, lethal environment of the modern battlefield. Out of this crisis, the XM-1 program was born, and it was guided by a revolutionary new philosophy. Instead of a balanced design, the American engineers were ordered to prioritize three characteristics above all else: even cost, firepower, mobility, and first and foremost, crew survivability. This last point was a radical departure. American doctrine was coming to view the highly trained professional four-man crew as the most valuable component of the weapon system. The tank was a replaceable piece of hardware. The crew was an investment of time, money, and experience that was nearly impossible to replace in wartime. Every design decision in the Abrams flowed from this core principle. The answer to the new generation of shaped charge warheads and high-energy kinetic penetrators was a revolutionary new armor system developed in secret by the British and codenamed Chobham. It was not simply a slab of steel, but a complex composite matrix of layered ceramics, steel plates, and other secret materials designed to shatter and deflect incoming projectiles. This armor was incredibly heavy, which in turn dictated the tank's large size and immense weight. To move this mobile fortress, designers made another radical choice: the AGT-1500 gas turbine engine. While the Soviets mocked its fuel consumption, American engineers saw its unmatched advantages. It had a phenomenal power-to-weight ratio, giving the 60-ton Abrams the acceleration of a sports car. It could go from a standstill to over 30 miles per hour in a matter of seconds, allowing for shoot-and-scoot tactics that a diesel-powered tank could never match. It was also mechanically simpler than a comparable diesel, and, most surprisingly, incredibly quiet at idle, giving it the ability to lie in a silent ambush, a significant tactical advantage. But the most important innovation was internal. The designers tackled the problem of ammunition explosions by physically isolating the main gun rounds from the crew. The shells were stored in the turret bustle, behind armored blast doors, in a compartment designed with intentionally weak blowout panels on the roof. If the ammunition was hit and detonated, the force of the explosion would be channeled upwards, away from the crew compartment. The crew, shaken but alive, could potentially guide their damaged tank back to safety, get it repaired, and fight another day. For a Soviet tanker, whose comrade sitting next to him was effectively leaning against a stack of high explosive propellant, this concept was utterly inconceivable. It was a level of care for the individual soldier that simply did not exist in their military philosophy. The Abrams wasn't just a new tank, it was a new way of thinking about war. It was a land battleship, a defensive powerhouse built to withstand the storm and kill the enemy from a distance. As the 1,980 seconds drew to a close, these two diametrically opposed philosophies, forged in different histories and aimed at different wars, were set on a collision course. One was a rapier, the other a shield. One believed in the expendable many, the other in the survivable few. And the Soviets, in their confident laughter, had no idea that the shield was also a mirror, about to reflect their own firepower back at them with terrifying consequences. February 26, 1991. The featureless, windswept desert of southern Iraq, designated on military maps as grid coordinate 73 easting. A brutal shamal, a sandstorm of blinding intensity, had descended upon the battlefield, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. For Captain Rahim al-Jamil of the Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakalna division, the storm was a gift from Allah. He sat buttoned up in the commander's hatch of his T-72 M1, a formidable export version of the Soviet Union's premier battle tank. His unit was dug in, forming a crescent-shaped screen, waiting. His Soviet advisors had drilled this into him for years. In a defensive position, the low-slung T-72 was nearly invisible. Let the enemy come to you. Let them blunder into your kill sack. Herr felt a grim confidence. His tank was a proven design, its 125mm gun a weapon of legendary power. The intelligence report stated the Americans were coming, leading with their new, untested Abrams tank. Rahim and his men had studied the silhouettes. They knew its weaknesses. Its high profile would make it an easy target. Its turbine engine would choke on the sand being whipped into the air by the shamal. He pictured the engagement in his mind, the same scenario he had run 100 times in simulations. The Americans, blind in the storm, would stumble forward. His gunner would acquire a target, a large, clumsy shape materializing out of the swirling dust. He would give the order to fire. The 3BM-42 Mango Sabot round, a depleted uranium penetrator designed by the brilliant minds in Moscow, would slam into the Abrams, punch through its frontal plate, and turn the decadent American crew into incinerated meat. It was the natural order of things. Soviet design philosophy, forged in the crucible of real warfare, would triumph over the bloated, overly engineered American machine. He listened to the rhythmic hiss of the sand against his hull and waited for the sound of approaching engines. He expected to hear the high-pitched whine of turbines long before he saw anything. His expectations and the entire foundation of Soviet armored doctrine were about to be systematically dismantled in less than 30 minutes of unimaginable violence. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong was not a sound, but a sudden, terrifying silence. Over the company radio net, a frantic voice from a forward observation post screamed, "Enemy tanks! They are all ready!" The transmission cut out in a burst of static. Rahim frowned, straining his eyes against the vision block, seeing nothing but a roiling brown wall of sand. Then another tank commander, his voice tight with panic, shouted, "I'm hit. I don't know from where. I never saw them." And then chaos erupted. Through the storm, not in front of him, but somehow among his carefully laid out defensive positions, came the flashes of catastrophic explosions. One after another, his fellow T-72 seconds erupted into incandescent fireballs, their turrets launched skyward like champagne corks, trailing black smoke. There were no muzzle flashes preceding the impacts, no sound of incoming rounds. It was as if the tanks were simply ceasing to exist by an act of an unseen god. This was the first shock, the shock of the unseen. The American Abrams tanks of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment were not blind. They were equipped with a weapon the Iraqis and their Soviet advisors had fatally underestimated: thermal sights. While Rahim and his gunners stared into an impenetrable curtain of sand, the American crews saw the battlefield with crystal clarity. The hot engines and hulls of the dug-in T-72 seconds glowed like white-hot beacons against the cool desert background. For the Americans, it wasn't a battle. It was a target shoot. Then Rahim's gunner yelled, "Target! 11 o'clock! 1,000 meters!" Out of the swirling dust, a shape coalesced. A monster. The M1A. 1 Abrams. It was moving impossibly fast, gliding over the sand with an eerie smoothness, its turret already traversing towards them. It was not the clumsy land yacht he had been promised. It was a predator. "Fire!" Rahim screamed. The T-72 bucked as the 125mm cannon roared, sending its best armor-piercing round across the desert. Rahim held his breath, waiting for the secondary explosion, the bloom of fire that signified a kill. He saw the tracer from his round streak across the sand and strike the Abrams dead center on its frontal turret armor. There was a brilliant, magnesium-white flash of impact, and then nothing. The American tank didn't stop. It didn't even seem to slow down. It just kept coming, a featureless, implacable specter emerging from the storm. The Iraqi crew was stunned. They couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. It was a moment of profound, physics-defying cognitive dissonance. Their beast slayer, the pinnacle of Soviet anti-armor technology, had bounced off the Abrams like a pebble thrown against a fortress wall. The shock was not of failure, but of impossibility. It was as if the fundamental laws of the universe had been suspended. A lifetime of training, a nation's military doctrine, all of it was rendered meaningless in that single horrifying instant. Before Rahim or his crew could process this new reality, before the autoloader could even begin to ram another useless shell into the breach, a flash erupted from the Abrams' main gun. They never heard the sound of the incoming round. The American M829 depleted uranium penetrator, nicknamed the Silver Bullet, travels at nearly a mile per second. For the crew of Rahim's T-72, the world simply ended. The round struck the front of their turret, and unlike their own, it did not bounce. The sheer kinetic energy of the long-rod penetrator turned the T-72's conventional steel armor into a superheated plasma. A jet of molten metal and spall shot through the crew compartment at hypersonic speed, stripping the flesh from their bones and causing the ammunition stored in the carousel to detonate an instant later. The last thing Rahim al-Jamil ever knew was a silent, blindingly white light. For the American tankers of Eagle Troop, 2nd ACR, the Battle of 73 Easting was a blur of thermal signatures and rapid-fire commands. Captain H.R.R. McMaster, the troop commander, spurred his 9 Abrams tanks and 12 Bradley fighting vehicles forward, straight into the teeth of the storm and the heart of the Iraqi defense. His crews were calm, professional, and utterly lethal. Their mantra was simple: see first, shoot first, kill first. Their thermal sights gave them an almost supernatural advantage, allowing them to engage and destroy the Iraqi tanks before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The radio chatter was a cool, efficient litany of destruction. Target T-72, 12 o'clock, on the way. A pause. Target destroyed. Next target, 9 o'clock, firing. A pause. Kill. The immediate aftermath for the Tawakalna division was not a retreat. It was an annihilation. In just 23 minutes, a cornerstone of the much-vaunted Iraqi Republican Guard was utterly shattered. Dozens of T-72 seconds and other armored vehicles were turned into smoldering, blackened husks, their crews erased. The carefully planned Soviet-style defense had collapsed into a panicked rout. The radio channels that had been filled with confident reports minutes earlier were now either silent or choked with the screams of dying men and the terrified warnings of those who had witnessed the impossible. Their tanks cannot be killed. One Iraqi officer was heard shouting before his transmission was cut short. The doctrine had no answer for this. There was no contingency for an enemy whose armor was impervious and whose guns could kill with impunity from beyond visual range. It was a complete system failure, a doctrinal collapse played out in a theater of fire and twisted metal. The reports that would eventually filter back to stunned Soviet military advisors in Baghdad and then to a horrified general staff in Moscow would sound like the ravings of madmen. But the evidence, burned into the sands at 73 Easting, was undeniable. The game had changed. The confident laughter that had echoed in the briefing tents of East Germany just a few years earlier had died in the desert, replaced by a chilling realization: the West, and America in particular, had made a technological leap that had rendered an entire generation of Soviet armor obsolete overnight. The absolute devastation at 73 Easting was not a fluke, nor was it merely the result of a better armored tank. It was the first battlefield demonstration of a fully integrated, systematic approach to armored warfare that the Soviets had failed to anticipate. They had focused their intelligence on armor thickness and gun caliber, viewing the tank as a duelist. The Americans had built a system, a network of interlocking technologies that transformed the Abrams from a mere tank into the apex predator of a new digital battlefield. This system was built around a trinity of sight, calculation, and navigation that rendered the Soviet concept of massed assault obsolete. The first element of this trinity was the gunner's primary sight, a marvel of engineering that gave the Abrams crew the eyes of a god. Its thermal imager was not a primitive light intensifier like Soviet night vision, which needed ambient light from the moon or stars and produced a blurry, green-hued image. The American thermal sight detected minute differences in heat, painting a high-contrast picture in shades of black and white, regardless of darkness, smoke, fog, or even sandstorms. A running T-72 engine, hot from use, stood out against the cool night desert like a bonfire. The Americans didn't need to see the tank, they just needed to see its heat. This godlike vision was paired with the second element, a digital mind. When an American gunner placed his crosshairs on a thermal signature, a press of a button sent an invisible beam of light from a laser rangefinder to the target and back, calculating the exact distance down to the meter in an instant. This data, along with input from sensors measuring wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure, and even the slight droop of the gun barrel from gravity, was fed into an advanced ballistic computer. In less time than it takes to blink, the computer produced a perfect firing solution, automatically elevating the cannon to the precise angle needed to ensure the sabot round would arrive at the exact point the gunner was aiming at, 2 kilometers away. The third, and perhaps most revolutionary, element was the gift of unerring direction. For the first time in the history of warfare, an armored force was equipped with the global positioning system. While Soviet-trained Iraqi commanders navigated the featureless desert with maps, compasses, and the constant fear of getting lost, American tank commanders looked at a small screen that told them their exact location on the planet. This single technology unlocked a new dimension of strategy. It allowed for audacious, high-speed flanking maneuvers across hundreds of miles of empty desert at night, with a level of coordination and precision that was previously unimaginable. The Seven Corps' famous Hail Mary flanking maneuver during Desert Storm simply would not have been possible without it. This system, thermal sight, laser rangefinder, ballistic computer, and GPS, created a pattern of engagement that repeated itself with nightmarish consistency across the battlefield. The Americans could see, shoot, and move in conditions that left their opponents utterly blind and paralyzed. This pattern of dominance was not confined to a single battle. It became the brutal, defining reality of the ground war, written in fire and steel across the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait. Consider the experience of an Iraqi T-72 platoon from the Republican Guard's Hammurabi division dug into a defensive line south of Basra. It is the dead of night, hours after the main coalition assault has begun. The platoon commander, a young lieutenant named Faisal, feels a certain security in the oppressive darkness. His own T-72's infrared searchlight is turned off to avoid giving away his position. Through his primitive night vision device, the world is a narrow, grainy tunnel of ghostly green. He knows the Americans are out there, somewhere in the blackness, but he believes the night is his shield. Suddenly, a tank 100 meters to his right explodes without a sound or a flash of warning. A column of fire and smoke punches into the night sky, the turret of the T-72 cartwheeling away into the darkness. Faisal's blood runs cold. Panic floods the radio net. Before he can even order his platoon to start their engines, a second of his tanks is hit and detonates. The crew is terrified. They are being slaughtered by an invisible enemy. They are firing their main guns wildly into the night, the muzzle flashes only serving as aiming beacons for the unseen hunters. Faisal screams at his driver to move, to get out of the kill zone, but as his tank lurches forward, his world is consumed by a silent, instantaneous flash of white. For the crew of the American M1A 2,000 meters away, the engagement was clinical. The Iraqi platoon appeared in their thermal sights as a neat row of glowing white signatures. The gunner of the lead Abrams, a staff sergeant from Ohio, calmly designated the first target. "On the way," he said, his voice flat over the intercom. He squeezed the firing stud. The tank rocked slightly. Without waiting to confirm the kill, he was already traversing to the next bright shape. "Next target," he announced. It took his platoon less than 60 seconds to eradicate Faisal's entire unit. This was not a battle. It was an extermination, and it highlighted the horrifying human cost of the technological gap. In another sector, during the Battle of Medina Ridge, the sheer efficiency of the American system was on full display. Here, the dug-in tanks of the Medina Division, one of the best-equipped units in the Iraqi army, faced the American 1st Armored Division. The engagement demonstrated the stunning effectiveness of the Abrams fire on the move capability. American M1A1S advanced not cautiously, but at speeds of over 30 miles per hour, their stabilized main guns remaining locked on targets as if floating on a gimbal. An Iraqi gunner in a stationary T-72 had the nearly impossible task of hitting a fast-moving target that was simultaneously firing back with lethal accuracy. An American gunner, on the other hand, could track a target while his own tank bounced and swayed over the rough terrain, fire, and score a direct hit from over 2,500 meters away. Eyewitness accounts from the battle describe a relentless rolling barrage of American fire. The Abrams and Bradley fighting vehicles worked in concert, a fluid, unstoppable wave of steel. The Bradleys would engage and suppress Iraqi infantry, and lighter vehicles with their 25mm chain guns and Tau missiles while the Abrams tanks focused on methodically eliminating the T-72 seconds. For the Iraqis, the experience was baffling and terrifying. They were trained to fight a static, defensive war from prepared positions. They were now facing an enemy that moved with the speed and ferocity of a cavalry charge, but possessed the firepower of heavy artillery. In a single day, the Medina division was shattered, losing hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles. It was a stark lesson in the gap not just in technology, but in tactical philosophy. The Americans had built a system for high-tempo maneuver warfare, and the Iraqis, with their Soviet doctrine, had brought a knife to a gunfight. The ultimate expression of this new American way of war was not tactical, but strategic. The entire ground campaign was predicated on the Abrams' ability to go where no army was supposed to go. The Iraqi High Command, fully expecting a frontal assault into Kuwait, had positioned the bulk of their elite Republican Guard divisions along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. They were dug in, prepared, and waiting for a head-on collision. That collision never came. Instead, the entire US 7 Corps, a massive armored fist of thousands of tanks and vehicles, performed a gigantic flanking maneuver, a Hail Mary, pass that swung far out into the Iraqi desert to the west. This vast, perfectly coordinated wheeling movement across hundreds of kilometers of barren, featureless terrain, conducted mostly at night and at high speed, was a strategic masterpiece made possible by GPS. When the 7 Corps slammed into the flank and rear of the Republican Guard, the Iraqis were caught completely by surprise. Their tanks were facing the wrong way, their supply lines were severed, their entire defensive strategy was rendered instantly irrelevant. The M1 Abrams hadn't just defeated its counterpart in battle, its mere existence, and the system that supported it, had allowed American commanders to completely unhinge the enemy's strategic center of gravity. Throughout these encounters, a single, chilling image came to symbolize this new form of American dominance. It was not a flag, nor was it the tank itself. It was the view through the gunner's thermal sight, the thermal ghost. In the cool, black and white world of the thermal imager, an enemy tank ceased to be a machine manned by other human beings. It was stripped of its camouflage, its national markings, its very identity. It became nothing more than a glowing, white-hot silhouette, a heat signature waiting to be serviced. The American gunner wasn't engaging a T-72, he was targeting a bright shape. This detached, impersonal view defined the one-sided nature of the conflict. It was warfare reduced to its most elemental, technological form, the simple act of placing a crosshair on a glowing ghost and pressing a button to make it disappear. This symbol of a disembodied digital enemy, visible only to the hunter, represented the absolute chasm that had opened between American and Soviet military technology. The pattern was now brutally, undeniably clear. What began as shock and disbelief had hardened into a horrifying certainty for any who stood against the M1 Abrams. The shield was unbreakable, and the spear it carried never missed. In the hushed, wood-paneled briefing rooms of the Soviet Ministry of Defense in Moscow, the atmosphere was not one of anger, but of a cold, creeping dread. The initial reports from Iraq had been dismissed as panicked exaggerations, the excuses of a defeated client state. But as Soviet military advisors were quietly exfiltrated from Baghdad, bringing with them grainy photographs, after-action reports, and first-hand accounts of the carnage, a horrifying picture began to emerge. It was a picture that was systematically deconstructed on a long table for the grim-faced marshals of the Soviet Union and the chief designers from the legendary tank bureaus of Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil. The evidence was irrefutable and utterly damning. They saw photographs of T-72 seconds, with neat, pencil-thin entry holes in their frontal armor, the point of impact surrounded by a telltale discoloration from extreme heat. Inside, the story was always the same: complete annihilation. They analyzed shell fragments and were baffled by the metallurgy of the American M829 penetrator, a material so dense and tough it defied their own manufacturing capabilities. A senior GRU analyst, a man who had spent his entire career studying NATO armored vehicles, stood before a silent, stunned audience. He didn't speak of tactics or Iraqi incompetence. He spoke of physics and engineering. "Comrades," he began, his voice low and devoid of emotion, "the reports indicate that our 3BM-42 penetrator, our very best anti-tank round, was incapable of defeating the frontal aspect of the M1, a 1 special armor at normal combat ranges. We have multiple, confirmed eyewitness accounts from our advisors of direct hits that resulted in nothing. The American round, however, did not suffer the same limitation. It appears to defeat the frontal armor of our T-72 at any and all combat ranges. A murmur went through the room. This wasn't a failure of a specific tank, it was a fundamental failure of their material science. The analyst then projected a slide, showing a blurry thermal image captured by an American source. "This," he said, gesturing to the glowing white shapes, "is how they saw the battlefield. While our crews were blind, they could see every one of our tanks as clearly as if it were daylight. They were not fighting tanks. They were eliminating signatures." The admission hung in the air, thick and suffocating. All the years of building more tanks, faster tanks, tanks with bigger guns, all of it had been rendered moot by an enemy who had changed the very nature of seeing. The Soviet realization was not just that they had fallen behind, it was that they were playing an entirely different game and they didn't even know the rules. The immediate response from the Soviet High Command was a desperate, almost frantic scramble for countermeasures. The threat was no longer theoretical, it was existential. The entire military posture of the Warsaw Pact, predicated on the unstoppable power of its armored formations, was now a house of cards. The order went out to the design bureaus. Solve the Abrams problem and solve it now. The first and most urgent priority was armor. If their steel couldn't stop the American penetrator, they would have to find something that could. The result was Contact 5, a second-generation explosive reactive armor, ERA. Unlike the first-generation bricks designed to defeat shaped charges, Contact 5 was a heavy, sophisticated system specifically engineered to defeat kinetic energy rounds. When struck by a long-rod penetrator, the explosive-filled cassettes would detonate, but not just outwards. The plates were designed to shift sideways at high speed, shearing the incoming rod and deflecting its energy. It was a brilliant and brutal piece of engineering, and it was rushed into production to be bolted onto the front of their new T-80U and T-72B tanks. Simultaneously, their metallurgists and ordnance experts worked feverishly to close the firepower gap. They developed the 3BM-46 Svinets, a new sabot round with a longer, denser tungsten penetrator designed to mimic the properties of the American depleted uranium rounds. For their anti-tank missiles, like the 9M119 Sphere fired from the T-80's main gun, they developed new tandem charge warheads, designed with a small initial charge to defeat reactive armor, followed by a larger main charge to penetrate the hull. While these efforts were underway, the KGB's Directorate T, responsible for scientific and technical intelligence, launched a worldwide effort to acquire the secrets of the Abrams. Agents were tasked with obtaining samples of Chobham armor, detailed schematics of the AGT-1500 turbine engine, and above all, the source code and hardware for the American thermal sights and ballistic computer. It was a shadow war fought in laboratories and back alleys, a desperate attempt to steal what they could not invent. But these countermeasures, born of desperation, ran headlong into the crumbling reality of the late-stage Soviet Union. The technological solutions were clever, but they were patchworks, not integrated systems. Contact 5 added tons of weight to the tanks, stressing their engines and suspensions. The new ammunition was an improvement, but it couldn't fully compensate for the inherent limitations of the two A-46 cannons' accuracy at long range. Most critically, they could not close the digital gap. Soviet industry, for all its might in producing steel and heavy machinery, was hopelessly behind in microelectronics, digital processing, and quality control. Their attempts to reverse engineer American thermal sights produced images that were less reliable, had lower resolution, and were prone to breaking down. They could copy the hardware, but they couldn't replicate the decades of institutional knowledge, the refined manufacturing processes, and the culture of precision engineering that made the American system so effective. The very foundation of the Soviet command economy, which had allowed them to mass-produce T-34 seconds to defeat Nazi Germany, was now a crippling liability. It could not produce the sophisticated, reliable electronics needed to compete on the digital battlefield. The attempt to counter the Abrams became a microcosm of the Soviet system's final, fatal decay. The psychological impact of this dawning realization on the Soviet military-industrial complex was profound, creating a tone of deep institutional insecurity that replaced the swagger of the early 80 seconds. For the proud tank designers at Uralvagonzavod, men who saw themselves as the best in the world, it was a source of deep professional humiliation. They had spent their lives perfecting a design philosophy, small, fast, simple, numerous, and had been proven catastrophically wrong. They were forced to watch as their finest creations were effortlessly swatted aside on the global stage. For the general staff, it induced a state of strategic paralysis. Their entire plan for a conventional war in Europe, the meticulously crafted Deep Battle, was now predicated on the assumption that their premier armored units would suffer suicidal loss rates against the M1 Abrams. They could still flood the Fulda Gap with thousands of tanks, but they now understood that it would be a flood of coffins. The earlier confidence was replaced by a grudging, bitter respect for their adversary. They stopped seeing the Abrams as a bloated folly and began to see it for what it was. A manifestation of a technological and industrial power they could no longer hope to match. In a candid, declassified memo from 1991, a senior Soviet armor general summarized the new, terrifying reality for the Politburo. "We have spent 50 years preparing for a war of mass and attrition. The Americans have prepared for a war of information and precision. In Iraq, we saw the result. They can see in the dark. They do not miss. Their tanks are fortresses. To engage them with our current equipment under their preferred conditions is to invite annihilation." The laughter had long since died. In its place was the silent, chilling calculus of defeat. The story of the M1 Abrams versus the T-72 is more than a tale of two tanks. It is the final, decisive chapter in a long, ideological war fought not just with armies, but with competing philosophies of science, industry, and human value. The Soviet Union built tanks. The United States built an integrated weapon system. This distinction is the unique angle through which American dominance was ultimately expressed in the deserts of Iraq. Moscow's approach was hardware-centric, a direct lineage from the T-34 seconds of World War II. Their answer to any problem was invariably more steel, a bigger gun, a more powerful engine. They perfected the individual components of armored warfare. The American achievement, however, was in software, both literally in the code of their ballistic computers and figuratively in the doctrine that bound their systems together. They understood that the tank of the future would not be won by the thickest armor, but by the side that could control information, the side that could see first, decide fastest, and shoot most accurately. This was a victory of a system that valued the network over the node. An Abrams was not just a tank, it was a lethal node in a vast, interconnected web of American military power. Its GPS connected it to satellites. Its thermal sights allowed it to share a common, clear picture of the battlefield with other tanks, with Bradley fighting vehicles, with Apache helicopters, and with a 10 Warthogs circling miles above. This was the quintessence of the air-land battle doctrine, a symphony of combined arms that the Soviets had theorized about, but could never practically implement on such a scale. The Soviet command economy, for all its brute force ability to churn out thousands of identical tanks, was institutionally incapable of fostering the kind of interdisciplinary innovation, precision manufacturing, and quality control needed to build such a complex, integrated system. The Abrams was the product of a society that had mastered the microchip, advanced optics, and global logistics. The T-72 was the product of a society that had mastered the mass production of steel. In 1991, the information age decisively crushed the industrial age on the battlefield. The ultimate, brutal demonstration of this systemic collapse occurred during the night of February 26th and 27th, 1991, on a stretch of road north of Kuwait City that would forever be known as the Highway of Death. Here, thousands of retreating Iraqi vehicles, a mix of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and civilian trucks laden with looted goods, were caught in a massive traffic jam. They were blind, disorganized, and utterly exposed. What descended upon them was not a battle, but a technological reaping. For the Iraqi soldiers trapped on that highway, it was an experience of pure, sensory-deprived horror. The night was pitch black. One moment, they were sitting in a silent, stalled column of vehicles. The next, the vehicle in front of them would simply vanish in a silent, brilliant flash of white light, hit by an unseen Abrams round from a tank positioned on a ridge 2 kilometers away in the darkness. Seconds later, an A-10 Warthog, completely invisible and inaudible until the moment of attack, would sweep down, its 30mm Gatling gun emitting a terrifying buzz that sounded like the tearing of a giant fabric. spewing a stream of depleted uranium shells that shredded trucks and armor alike. Apache helicopters, hovering like ghosts in the night, would unleash Hellfire missiles that seemed to come from nowhere, each one finding a hot engine and turning a vehicle into a funeral pyre. This was not a tank duel, it was a system at work. The Abrams and Bradleys formed a blocking force, their thermal sights identifying and methodically destroying any military vehicle that tried to break out. Overhead, the aircraft, guided by target information from ground forces and J-STAR's surveillance planes, dismantled the column piece by piece. For the men on the ground, there was no countermeasure. They couldn't see who was shooting them. They couldn't shoot back. Their only experience was of a sudden, incomprehensible end delivered from the darkness. The Highway of Death was the final, horrifying proof of the concept. When the American system was fully unleashed, its enemies did not just lose. They were removed from the equation with an impersonal, machine-like efficiency. It was the thermal ghost made manifest on a strategic scale. In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, many former Soviet designers and generals got their first chance to see an M1 Abrams up close. They climbed inside, marveled at the spaciousness of the crew compartment, and were reportedly stunned by the ergonomic design and the quality of the finish. But the most profound difference, the one that truly defined the two philosophies, was not in the armor or the gun, but in the design's ultimate purpose. The Soviet tank was built to be an expendable weapon, and its crew, by extension, was treated as an expendable component within it. The ammunition carousel at their feet was a constant, implicit acknowledgement of this fact. The Abrams, by contrast, was built from the inside out with a single overriding principle: to bring its crew home. The armored blast doors, the blowout panels, the separation of crew and ammunition, these were not features designed to win a single battle, but to win a war by preserving the most precious asset, the trained, professional American soldier. This is the enduring legacy of the Abrams. It is not just the lopsided kill ratios or the legendary performance at 73 Easting. It is the silent testimony of the thousands of American tankers who fought in these machines and survived encounters that would have been a death sentence in any other tank in the world. The Soviets had perfected a tank for a war of attrition, where human lives were a resource to be spent in vast quantities. The Americans had built a tank that reflected the values of a society that, for all its flaws, placed an immense premium on the life of the individual. The confident laughter of Soviet tankers in 1988 was silenced, not merely by a better tank, but by a superior philosophy. They believed the key to victory was the brilliant sacrifice of the many. The Americans proved it was the calculated survival of the few. The T-72 became a symbol of a fallen empire, its wreckage littering the world's battlefields. The Abrams became a symbol of a new kind of power, a quiet, deadly testament to the fact that in modern warfare, the most dominant force is not the machine that is most easily lost, but the one that is most determinedly saved.